tell us on the chat where you're connecting from? Bonjour. Hello, everyone. There is interpretation. Please find your favorite language at the bottom of your screen. Hola, Catalina. Hello. Hello, Meredith. Colleagues from Somaliland. Ajá. La gente se conectan desde Costa Rica, Lima, Perú. We're going to start in a minute. Nous allons démarrer dans un instant. Bonjour. Je vous invite à identifier au bas de votre écran le bouton pour l'interprétation. Hello, Bikalpa. Hola, Paola. Colleagues from UNESCO. Household connecting from Indonesia. Hello, everyone. We're going to start in a minute. Thank you for connecting. Hello, Giti. Okay. So I guess we are about 143 people right now. We'll start in just a minute. Frank, looking at you for a cue. Ready to roll?
Yes, I'm ready.
Excellent. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to this first of 4 webinars on equity, privatization, and the right to education. My name is Amélie Gagnon, and I'm leading the development unit at UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, IIEP. If equality is the foundation of the right to education, equity is definitely conditioned to fulfill it. And this is the way, in the direction that we're working at IIEP from our offices in Paris, Buenos Aires, and Dakar. We support ministries in all parts of the world to strengthen planning and development, planning and management processes in education systems. So part of our work is training, technical cooperation, research, and development. And over the last decades, we have published different studies and methodologies that address the interface between law, rights, and education, and also how different policies, such as the regulation of private provision of education, can affect access, equity, and overall development. So this is a few examples of the manuals that we've been developing over the last decades, and we'll post the links on the webinar webpage. And we're currently working on designing a tool that will support planners in ensuring that education sector plans can reflect current and forthcoming efforts in fulfilling the right to education. So all of this brings us to today. And within the research and development team, we designed this series of webinars to take stock of the most recent research in the area of equity, privatization, and the right to education. And it's really our pleasure to welcome you, Frank, to this four-part series. So Dr. Frank Adamson is a assistant professor of education leadership and policy studies at Sacramento State University, and you study different ways that political and economic approaches to education relate to student experiences and opportunity in school and communities. And I remember vividly your work on school segregation. It was extremely inspiring work. So welcome, and you will be our guide through this session of 4 webinars. And these webinars are built in a way that, consistent way across the themes. So basically, after a short introduction by myself, Frank will walk us through the different topics that we'll be covering by the series. And we will have some guests joining us through the series. And I will let Frank introduce them and the structure of the series in just a minute. So Throughout the webinar series, we're going to also take insights from you, the audience, and invite you to interact with us. So I see that the Q&A box is already being well used, and I invite you all to continue to use it throughout the series so that we can take your questions and react to your insights. Interpretation to French, Spanish, and Portuguese is available to you, so you can select your favorite language at the bottom of your screen. Most of the interaction will be in English, so feel free to use interpretation, but you can ask your questions in one of these 4 languages as you prefer. My colleague Camila already informed you that this meeting is recorded, so we will share the recording after all. So I guess, Frank, without further ado, let me give you the floor, and let you guide us through this first event. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Amelie. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Let's see if I can start to share my screen here. Great. So today, first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining. My favorite part of this actually was the marketing part, because I went through and looked at all of the emails and contacts that I have made, and it was truly humbling to see everyone around the world that is doing work in education. And I thank you today for all the work you do and for coming here to hear what I have to say about the topics of equity, privatization, and the right to education. So a little bit of background on the who, what, why. One of the things that you might not know about me is that I started off over 20 years ago in education research. And at that time, the UNESCO Institute for Statistics had just really started. And one of the things we were doing was going to countries in the Caribbean and doing technical assistance around the world to do mapping of the international classification of education. So we're trying to build up this system of connecting our data to the realities of people around the world and helping education ministries do that work. And 10 years ago, I wrote my dissertation on the relationship of inequality, income inequality, and education systems using some of those data, the PISA assessment and the TIMSS assessment. So again, focusing at this high level of the education phenomena of the day and doing cross-national comparisons. And then today, we're coming back to UNESCO in this planning sense of what are we thinking about today? What are the main issues of the day, and how do we think about them both at the national level and even the subnational level, and then internationally. So it's a pleasure to reconnect and to be offering this. So let's see. So why are we doing this webinar series? Basically, there's varying levels of awareness about education privatization. Some folks think that it means private schools. Other folks spend half a lifetime delving into a very complex topic that has a lot of permutations that we'll get into. So this is why we're doing it, is to help bring the material to light. And the idea is to have this information hopefully distilled in a way that's more comprehensible. So this is not going to be a heavy research-based analysis. This is going to be trying to bring the main issues to light. And we've organized it in a series of 4-hour-long webinars because it's a lot of information and it's just too much to take in one go. So what we've done is laid out 4 different webinars with 4 discrete topics. The first one today, we're talking about introduction to the forms and the diffusion of education privatization. And I'm going to just try to slow down a little bit because we are translating. So that's what we're doing today. I'll lead you through that overview. The second webinar on the 24th of February, we're going to be looking more at the evidence side So today is setting up the definitions. Next time, looking at the evidence. We're going to be joined by Dr. Tony Verger from the Autonomous University in Barcelona, who has done a lot of global research on the phenomena of education privatization and has some key new findings to share. The third webinar on March 3rd, we're going to look at what education means as a human right. And specifically, we're going to do some analysis and presenting of the Abidjan principles. They just turned 2 last week. We had a celebration, a birthday, and we'll again try to break down the Abidjan principles, what they are, where they came from. Basically, they are the summary of human rights law on the right to education. And I'll be joined there by Ashina Mtsumi, who is a human rights expert. And finally, on the 10th of March, the fourth webinar, we'll have a final discussion, and I'll be joined by the Open Society Foundation's Director for Education Programs, Camilla Crosso, who will broaden the scope to early childhood, to higher ed, to how do we respond during COVID, these larger issues that we need to think about as we move forward with these different contexts and different issues. Okay. So basically today we're putting together a little bit of a puzzle. The first part, we're going to talk about the definitions and the components of education privatization. We have a brief stop in national education decision-making, pathways of that. And then we're going to talk specifically about different pathways of education privatization, have some country examples, and then we have a new heat map to share with you. And by the way, this webinar is actually built on, as a primary source, a new primer on education privatization. And hopefully Amelie can put the link to that in the chat box if she has not already.
I will do it in a second.
Okay, perfect. So moving on to privatization, topic of the day. There's privatization, 2 main types by Ball and Udall. There's what they call the endogenous privatization in education, and that's the importing of ideas, practices from the private sector in order to make the public sector more business-like. And then there's a privatization of education, which is opening up the education sector to private sector participation, usually on a for-profit basis, and using the private sector to design, manage, and deliver education. So there's a distinction, and this gets to the different ways in which privatization functions. Now we'll move on to our different definitions. And I know that this is a lot of text on a slide, but will not read my slides, but I'm going to read this one because it's important to understand what we're talking about here. And we've broken it into 3 main components: provision and funding, management, and property ownership. So, and these are different foci of definitions that different academics and researchers have looked at. So the first one on provision, the transfer of activities, assets, and responsibilities from government and public institutions and organizations to private individuals and agencies. So that focuses on assets, funding. On the management side, you can have privatization being the transfer of public sector responsibility to privately owned or operated organizations or companies. For example, non-governmentally run schools such as private or charter schools. So that's who's actually managing the delivery of education in this case. And then 3, there's the property ownership. The World Bank describes privatization as the act of reducing the role of government or increasing the role of the private sector in activity or the ownership of assets. So what we've done here is bring together these different types of definitions into one newish definition. I'm not saying it's comprehensive, it's a complicated topic, but it's trying to bring together these different aspects so it can help us understand what we're looking at and what we're looking for when we see the phenomenon. And that is the shifting of state responsibility for the management and provision of equitable, high quality education to the non-state sector, for the private sector, and including for funding and ownership and regulating government to a subsidiary role. And that's a really important concept, the subsidiary role. And I will talk a little bit about that as we get into a little bit of the history of where this came from. So we have this, now we have, what would it mean to have private schools and education privatization? How do we take this first at an institutional level? So if we were looking at a school, what would we say? At the funding level, do the families or the governments fund the school? That's, is that a public or private funding? The management level, who's overseeing the content? And at the ownership level, who owns the physical capital? And we can see if the answers to all three of these questions were public, then it would be public. And if it was private, then it would be private. But education privatization is usually the mix of these three. So for instance, you have a charter school, which is funded publicly, but is managed sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. And who owns the physical capital? Sometimes the state does, sometimes there's a lease, sometimes the private charter management organization owns it. So there's just different ways in which this triangle operates that we can start to understand the relationship between the public sector and private actors. So before I move on, that was a good chunk of information right there. And what we want to do now is just take a little poll. And I think Amelie is going to put in the chat or conduct a poll, which is going to ask us a question about which aspects of this definition of education privatization resonate most with you.
So it is live now. You can select any combination or only one of the suggested answers. So the question is, which aspects of the definition of education privatization resonates most with you?
And by resonate most, I mean, you could interpret that as what's happening in your area, in your region, in your geography. Are we able to see results, or are we giving folks a second?
Let's check.
All right.
Camila?
We still have a number of people voting.
Okay. So let's see if we get a high voting score.
Okay, I think most people who wanted to vote have now voted, so I'll close the poll. Last chance. And I'll put up the results for everyone to see.
Aha.
Interesting.
And the interpreters say.
So it seems like funding is the more important issue or more resonant issue by a hair, really, with management close behind and ownership also quite a big feature. So that's very helpful in a sense of that these categories are actually, or these components of privatization are important in people's education realities.
No, definitely, and it shows that they really go hand in hand, and it probably means also that it's so closely tied that a lower number of factors might not be enough to fully understand the phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely. This is a high level, high grain size. So I want to shift now to a bit of a conversation of how we got here. So this slide starts in the 1950s, really with the birth of the modern phenomenon of education privatization. And that's Milton Friedman. And he's claiming out of the Chicago school that public schools are a monopoly, and that they're denying the parents, who are consumers in a market-based model, choice in their education system. And I just want to back up a little bit from this moment here, because what we're really in the middle of is quite an age-old question, right? And the question is, who provides better public services, governments or markets? And that question has been debated since Adam Smith. It's has its foundations in sociology. In the 20th century, we see von Hayek, looking at Friedrich von Hayek, an economist, proposing the marketization of economies. And we remember that von Hayek fought in World War I. And World War I, he saw the destruction caused by very strong states. So it's not an unfounded conclusion that markets should be the way of doing it when you come from that context. But then we look at the market destruction of the social fabric in the collapse of Wall Street and the 29 that shut off the Great Depression. And how do we get out of that? We got out of that with Keynesian economics from John Maynard Keynes, which was a model of public investment in the United States, led to the New Deal. And there were that public investment, and it means running debts on the front side, but actually pays off in the end. You have a robust public sector at the end of the day. And so we can see that this sort of ping pong between our economic realities, our public sector realities has been going back and forth for a long time. So in the current version of education privatization, we have Milton Friedman coming up with the idea of vouchers, and first enacted at a scale in Chile, where there was essentially a neoliberal experiment conducted. And I'll discuss Chile more in depth, but that happened in the 70s, leading to the adoption of a voucher system in 1980. And in the 80s, the US and the UK had policy reforms promoting marketization. The World Bank was promoting a privatization, Global South. And then Sweden switched in the 90s fairly rapidly, some would say very rapidly, from a social welfare model to a national marketization model in the sector of education. So that's some of the genesis of how this idea came to be. And what I want you to also look at is the policy borrowing that's happening between the global North and the global South. The Chicago school comes up with an idea, and then it gets exported to Chile and then re-imported to the US and the global North, and exported to other countries in the global South. So we're in this constant political process of certain ideas gaining leverage. So how does this play out in the national education systems? And we have a kind of very distilled look at what happens in national education systems in terms of, if you think about privatization as a policy driver. So a government or a ministry decides that they want to pursue this approach. There are quite often specific rationales, in this case, economic rationales, that are applied and given. So those rationales would be, in this case, often efficiency as a rationale, that private sector runs things more efficiently, that, of course, Milton Friedman's original idea that parents don't have choices and they deserve choices. So those rationales play out in different types of education mechanisms. And these are basically types of schools: low-fee private schools, charters, voucher systems, So we look at the interplay of these three, and that's sort of just at the national level, understanding how policy works. And then I'm going to lay out how the privatization of education can occur. And this is some of our research and others' research into the different pathways to privatization. So there are 5 key pathways that we found. There are historical legacy of private schools. So that's when you have private schools in the Netherlands, is a classic example of this. They've been part of the education system forever. So that's the legacy part. There can be when privatization is needed, or governments want to have it, or people want to have it because there's a dearth of public provision in schools. This is primarily found in low-income countries. There can be the catastrophe pathway. This is one of the really unfortunate ones. I mean, it's all problematic, but you have in the United States, Hurricane Katrina really fundamentally changing the fabric of New Orleans as a city. You have Puerto Rico, same thing, Haiti, and other examples. Naomi Klein does a really good job of explaining this in her books about how catastrophe actually opens the doorway for different ways of doing things that are, in her mind, not necessarily always to the benefit of those involved. There can be an ideological pathway. So that means there's the rhetoric of school choice and just a general disillusionment with public institutions. And then there can be an effort to modernize while controlling costs. That's the typical efficiency argument. And how does this work? So we have the mechanism. So you can see the pathways, and these different arrows are showing you where these are likely to land, right? So we see that the private schools or low-fee private schools or have this historic legacy or dearth of public provision. And you can see here in our components, the ownership is private, management private, funding private. And you see over here in the saturation column that we have primarily public systems at the top, and then all the way down to primarily privatized systems at the bottom. And so we are, and this is an incomplete list of systems. AD has one of the largest private school providers in the world. For instance, they also fall somewhat into the catastrophe column. But these are the different mechanisms. So private schools, there's the sort of public-private partnership, which can manifest in a variety of ways, including charter schools in the US and academies in the UK. Neo-vouchers and vouchers are different ways to subsidize families attending private schools. So a voucher is when you are providing money to a family specifically, and it goes either to the family or directly to the institution. But if the money follows the student and not the school. And the neo-vouchers is there are a variety. That's a whole subject of literature that Kevin Wellner has written on, and others. And that's how you can use the tax code in different ways to different benefits of different parties to incentivize private schooling. And we see that the vouchers are more, neo-vouchers in the US and Canada, and then in and the vouchers in sort of, you can imagine that as a Swedish system, and of course, Chile. Okay, so then we're going to look a little bit at 3 country examples. So in India, we have this basically the example of the dearth of public schools. So there's an underinvestment that leads to a dearth of public schools. And then that leads to a low-fee private school. And if we looked at it from our policy driver perspective, there's this lacking of public infrastructure, then resource scarcity and efficiency are both rationales that are used, and they manifest in low-fee private schools, vouchers, subsidized private schools. And this school quality is highly contested and inconclusive. So what we've done here is laid out, and this is a really important point that we're going to get to in more depth in the second webinar, but that this doesn't happen to everyone, right? There are usually the private options are the ones that are provided to the more poor, the rural, or the urban, and more marginalized populations, right? And so that really is a thread. As we said, equity is not really a topic; it's a thread that's running through our entire webinar series. And this is a way of visually displaying this inequity, where we see that these options are popping up in very specific places with very specific populations, and that happens in a similar way around the world, which is why we study the phenomenon globally. So here we have it happening in India. And then if we go back to our map here, we can look at a different example, New Orleans. So in New Orleans, we have this catastrophe of how privatization unfolded, and very unfortunate, but important to note the timeline. In 2003, before Katrina, under the No Child Left Behind Act, the entire state of Louisiana, so not just the city of New Orleans, established what was called the Recovery School District. And that was basically to authorize the transfer of low-performing public schools to charter schools. And in 2005, then Hurricane Katrina hits, and that recovery school district, so the institutionalization of the opportunity to privatize was already instantiated in the system. And the system was then used to essentially, in 2005, fire the 7,000 teachers that were in the public schools and start to charterize the system. And one of the features, and I've done work on New Orleans, you can read long reports about them and infographics about them on the website that has the primer on it. But essentially, there are selection mechanisms for students that were deployed in the charter school system so that different types of students had different types of access to educational opportunity. And that is really the equity issue at play on the micro level of a city, in this case, that can all go all the way up to a country level or at an international level. And you see how it's working here with a policy driver of privatization. The economic rationale is school choice, and then the mechanism is charter schools. And then we zoom out to the national system in the United States, and we can see here again, this is where we can see some of the size of the phenomenon, but it's more important to see that in these places where this is happening, New Orleans, Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Camden, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., where I grew up, Oakland, California, these are all urban areas, and primarily they serve Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States. And so you have to ask yourself, when you're seeing a policy strategy deployed in such large extent to a very particular population, you have to start asking why. I mean, at a one example level, it can be a variation or an anomaly. But this is a systemic one, and I'm showing this here as it happening. We saw a similar map in India. We're seeing a very similar look in the United States. And then let's move now to Chile, where we'll go back as a third example of more of an ideological reform, where the policy drivers were the neoliberal ideology, and the economic rationale is choice. And in this case, in the Chilean case, the mechanism is vouchers. And so the reforms were voucher funding. This incentivized or gave a structure for increases to private schools, the number of private schools, And then those schools had both autonomy and accountability, the autonomy through decentralization and the accountability through a move towards high stakes testing, something that we'll talk about more in webinar 2 in terms of the relationship between the accountability movements and education privatization. Briefly, I already mentioned that there was a coup. So basically, I do want to point out that the year before the coup, Salvador Allende was president at the time, had pronounced that the year of education. So we can see that this shift from the social welfare model, the welfare state, to a subsidiary state is really strongly played out. And it has there are very strong geopolitics in terms of the U.S. involvement, both in the coup and then in the subsequent economic and military models that were used in Chile. The neoliberal policies were seen as a solution. And I just want to pause here really quickly because we use the word neoliberal a lot, and I want to just give a little bit of my take on the definition, and we discuss it more at length in my volume, Global Education Reform. But basically, it's new, liberal. And when you think about liberal, this goes back to Adam Smith's idea of a liberal, laissez-faire economy, where you would have, again, this idea that the market would be the driver of our political organization. And so the neoliberal movement has focused increasingly on privatization as a mechanism for doing just that. And what has happened? We have seen the increase of private voucher schools and a decrease in public schools. These figures show only part of the story. The Chilean story is, number one, still evolving, and number two, heavily researched. So if you are interested in the example of Chile, this is something that we've drawn from in the Global Education Reform volume, but there's a lot more research happening. But this just in terms of how privatization is rolled out over time, this graph really demonstrates the influence and increasing number of the private voucher schools, and then the distribution of the population. So on the left side, you can see that the public schools are the ones serving the lowest socioeconomic and the middle low group. And then the middle and middle high group are predominantly being served by the voucher schools, private subsidized. And then the purely private schools are serving the high SES group. And, the OECD was calling this the most segregated education system. And another researcher called it apartheid in education. So we can see that there is just a very dramatic difference in educational opportunity on offer by social class. So we're going to zoom back out here to the international level. So we have taken stock of the different components of privatization. We've looked at the different pathways in which it can happen. We've looked at 3 examples of how it happens in different countries through different pathways. And now we're trying to actually figure out, okay, well, what's happening at the global level if we zoom out? This is proven a bit difficult, because we want to map education privatization, but for starters, private providers are not necessarily compelled to disclose their number of pupils served or other information. Our international agencies have not specifically tracked the funding management and ownership, although there are components and we use them in our research. And the private providers also operate not often, but sometimes without state recognition or even the knowledge of the state. So you just have a pop-up school happening and nobody's really tracking it. So we're trying to answer the question of how widespread is this, and just to get a handle of it. And we're remembering our key fundamental definitional components of management, funding, and ownership. And in data, we were able to find management and funding data. So what we did at the country level was to average the average or mean percent enrollment in private schools, so the management function, and the percent of private funding. And then we took those numbers, that average, and grouped the percentages by quartile. And we did this for ISCED level 1. That's the International Standard Classification. ISCED 1 is for primary students. So this is our heat map of the world with the data that we have, and we can see that the global median is at 8.3% of education privatization by the limited data that we have. So not including ownership and only those two features. And we can see, that some features. So Chile, obviously highly represented. The US is showing some increased levels of privatization as we've seen, but as we can see, it's, very sporadic in terms of its geographic representation in the US. We can see a band across sub-Saharan Africa, India and Nepal in particular, and over in the Southeast Asia region as well. And in the primer, which I encourage you to download, another thing that we do is put an asterisk by countries with high out-of-school populations, because those countries could be candidates for increasing level of private actors, as those families are not being served by the state. And, of course, they're wondering, why, what can we do for our children? I mean, that's an important question. I want every parent to be asking that question. And so, that gets into our right to education and the state obligation to provide high quality education. So this is a two-way street here. But in any case, this is how we have just gotten a handle on where the phenomenon is happening at a broad scale, and we encourage more research and more development of data that more accurately depicts where this is happening, so we can understand what our at-risk populations are, and then within any particular country, understanding what the spread is by the type of students served, because that is where inequities of opportunity can occur. So that is the concludes this webinar, and we're going to open it up for Q&A, but I do want to plant the seed in your mind for next Wednesday, same time, February 24th, where we are going to compare the approaches and the lessons. So we will look at some of the evidence on these different approaches. We'll look at it through the lens of equity, as I said. And Dr. Virgil will join as a presenter. So I'll look at some of the national cases, and he's going to provide a more global overview. And with that, I will turn it back to Amelie.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Frank. This is always interesting. And I remember when I was working at UIS, UNESCO Institute for Statistics, it's true that they have definitions, but it's focusing mostly on either or. It's not combining necessarily different aspects of the role of private entities. So it's really interesting. And we had a lot of reactions from the audience. I'm kind of gathering a few questions at the same time. So perhaps starting back where with the definition, we have a few questions regarding what's the difference between a low cost and low fee? What's the difference, or where do we stop talking about privatization, but more about marketization of education? And a question: when are we going to problematize the privatization of education? So they might be these definitions. I mean, these contrasts might look simple, but I'm sure you have something to add on this.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the problematization of privatization will come out more in the second webinar, in terms of when we look at the evidence and the equity, in particular, concerns that arise within different types of privatization models. So that's, today was just understanding what the phenomenon is. And I think that there will be some, I know there will be some critiques of how this is rolled out in the next webinar.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to just say low cost versus low fee, or marketization of education?
Sure. So so can you run that question by me again? Sorry, I didn't have.
Just the difference between maybe what we call low cost and low fee schools.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the issues I have even with the idea of labeling something low cost or low fee is low is a very relative term. I think that we are thinking about what parents can afford and what they're having to make the choice to afford in these particular circumstances because of the abdication of the state in providing these families with really, this goes to the Adamson principles, what they have agreed to under human rights law to actually provide. And that is the power of the Adamson principles. When I think about the difference between a low cost school and a low fee school, it's like who's, for me, the question is who's paying and why are they paying? And what are they, what are the options that are not being delivered for them to actually be able to access a free, high quality public education? Because that is the fundamental bar. And I don't want to get too far into the Adamson principles, but that bar cannot be superseded by private involvement. It can't be displaced. That has to be accessible. And so that's one of the key provisions there. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. There were some comments made by Catalina and Imad about this idea that asking basically if the different levels of education are facing or can be analyzed with the same approach that you presented, mostly applied to ISCED 1 primary education. So are there the same mechanisms that apply to different educational level, and their focus was mostly on higher education, tertiary education?
So I'm not a tertiary education expert. Tertiary education functions a little differently. It functions differently as an entity and differently by country. But we are seeing an increasing encroachment of the private sector, just at a strategy level, at a thinking level in higher education. So I do think that it's a useful heuristic to think about, but I don't have evidence on it, and I wouldn't go so far to say as the phenomena will look the same. But I do think it's an important question, and this issue of the relationship between public interests and private sector is very important. You have to also keep in mind here, especially in higher education, that education starts to become more of a private good at the higher levels, right? I mean, the individual sees a lot of private in some ways investment of time, and in some countries resources, especially in the United States, in terms of money. And then they're making that investment because they're expecting to see individual dividends. So this relationship of how much is a public benefit, how much should it invest versus how much does a private individual obtain and how much they should invest. That's a dynamic question across the life cycle. But in K-12, we're thinking about the Adamson principles really guaranteeing that fundamental foundation as a state obligation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's a good reflection to have. There are a few colleagues in the audience, attendants, that are wondering if you can tell us a bit more about context and perhaps other regions. We had questions wondering about Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically there are people on the attendance that are wondering how come so much like I think it was a higher quintile for Australia and asking a bit more about what you think about the situation in Australia, Sweden. Peter is asking for Sweden, and Diana is asking for Colombia. If you have any insight, we know the focus of your studies are maybe located elsewhere, but and there's also a colleague asking to learn more on the neo-vouchers in Canada.
Okay, so we have had questions on every topic I've discussed. So let's see if I can run through them. Yeah, it's a good sign. Let's start with the African question. Because sub-Saharan Africa is where we see this phenomena playing out. We have, Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, was selected intentionally because there is this debate, contestation happening in the education system. And the launch of the Abidjan Principles was designed to bring about attention to, in particular, Cote d'Ivoire, and also to the African region in general. And, we see there are some very clear targeting of this is why we have the out of school population designated in the primer, because there is this quote unquote opportunity for private actors to get involved where the state has not upheld its obligations. And that in and of itself is an entire political question, right? Because, the global South, owes debt to the global North, and there's a whole debt servicing and a finance part of that. And this is a lot of the work on Action Aid about what is the relationship between the debt that you owe and also just domestic tax revenue that could be received or collected that would then support education systems or public sector work in these countries. So that is an entire thing that I want to just say is a reality out there in terms of how countries and education systems measure their investment. But we do see that in these gaps where we have a large populations in need, really, that private entities are stepping in, and the provision is very problematic in many ways. And so there's a lot of legal contestation about the right of these schools to operate in different places. I visited Mukuru in Nairobi and walked through to see the bridge schools and to see how, this idea of really bringing education provision, I hate this term, but it's called teacher proofing, right? So you have a curriculum on a tablet that a teacher's reading, that they don't have really the training to provide that dynamic pedagogical environment that we know that a child needs to really move forward in a serious way in their education. And so that I think is, emblematic of this focus on efficiency in a public sector where efficiency is not actually what is going to guarantee the human right to education, right? You efficiency means that you actually you're creating competition. You have winners and losers. These things where we're leaving people behind. And when we look at the evidence, we see that oftentimes the people that are left behind are the most marginalized. There are in a variety of different ways, special education students, and there's a lot of research on how all of that happens that we will unpack in the next webinar. On the regional, continuing around the world, I know that Australia is, I looked at that too. I'm like, that's interesting. I haven't had time to dig into it, but it is interesting to look at the findings. Colombia, I know that I think Brent Edwards has done work, and probably I think with Mauro Mochetti, and I just mispronounced his name, but there is work on different Latin American countries in particular. It's starting to come out. El Salvador, I think Brent is also studying. So there are different scholars that are really, this work is really gaining momentum in different countries. So I wouldn't want to speak to it, but I would reference it to other people. The Middle East, again, I have not looked deeply into the Middle East. There's only so much time in the day. It is a fascinating place in varied types of education systems. So I think that there's a dissertation out there waiting for somebody for sure. And then so I think that that's sort of the geographic. Sorry, I missed Sweden. And I think we are running. Oh, wait a little second. So
if you want, actually, perhaps this might be the actual, perhaps the last the question. But exactly, you mentioned in your first slides, that the situation in Sweden and Chile, and there's also a few colleagues that are wondering, what happened since in Chile, and like how can you update us, let's say, on the situation in these two countries, since you told us about their experience historically.
Right. Yes. So I have not looked deeply into Chile in the last couple of years. That's why I was referencing that I do know that there is a lot of work. What happened, but the story of Chile, as the process unfolded, right? So every country, every geography, every context is on a continuum here of how you're intersecting with a global phenomenon. And so Chile is sort of our longest run intersection. And there were some very serious class divisions happening. And that resulted in a couple of things. One, multiple waves of student movements, right? The students were saying, we are not getting educational inequality opportunity. So we had the 2000 wave, one wave, the 06 wave, the 12 wave that actually changed the political structure in the country, but they did not actually get rid of the voucher system. So there's still this issue of, the fundamental mechanism of inequality is still in place. Sweden, I think, is in a similar boat where it's unfolding. I think Bjorn Ostrom, my co-author, I just spoke with him recently. He's been sort of doing a lot of work on the equity dimensions of how the market model is playing out in Sweden. So I know he has an English webinar that he referred me to understand more about that. We could provide that link. But there's upwards of 200 countries. There's a lot of context to follow. But I do think that the bottom line is these narratives are still playing out. And there are, positive public examples of what's happening. And that line of work is going to be coming out in other venues coming up in the next 6 months as well. So be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, definitely. Perhaps we could gather a few links, a few references. You mentioned a few resources I think would be interesting to share on the webinar page. So on the chat box, I will put the link to the webinar series page on IIP's website, and we will populate this progressively with the recordings of the webinars and the different materials that we were mentioning. I think in any case, as some other colleagues pointed out on the chat, there is a market for, there is an opening, definitely an opportunity for a private market to open and to participate in education. This is something that is coming also from the reactions on the Q&A box. Some colleagues are asking what is UNESCO's position, but I think it's a reality for everyone that it's the responsibility of states to provide opportunities for learning and education. And indeed, there are some contexts where there are opportunities for a private market to either complement, supplement the public offering. But the question is not if we're for or against, right? The question is, it exists. How do we deal with it? And from IIP's perspective, how do we plan for making sure that every child gets the right opportunity for education? So. And I think what you presented as a kind of analytical grid, or this triangle, is really useful to kind of being able to analyze in a standardized way all the different and the plethora of varieties that different forms and shapes that private providers are. Yeah, how it's taking.
It's complex.
Yeah, exactly. So
it very much is.
Yeah, I think it's really useful. Perhaps you have some concluding remarks, Frank, before we close the session.
Well, I think that the main takeaways here are that we broke out the components of funding management and ownership. and we've looked at the pathways of how this happens. And it is a complex topic, and we've taken time to really delve into it. And I really appreciate the chat box. I'm trying to read it, and it's such interesting questions and diversity of opinion and from all over the world. So it shows that this issue is really front burner, and I would encourage everybody to come and continue the conversation next week. And I would just want to thank everybody for their time today.
Thanks to you. Thanks to our interpreters. And thanks to everyone who joined this session. At the height, I saw 277 people. So that's really interesting. I suggest that we continue this discussion as you suggested. I'll bring some resources to Twitter, some discussion to Twitter. So if you want to look at the questions that we didn't have time to address, we can do that a bit over there. And perhaps it will also feed the discussions for next week. And then, well, thank you, everyone. We'll share and we'll update as we go the webpage that I posted on the chat box. So on this note, thank you, everyone. Muito obrigada. Mil gracias a todos y todas. Merci à tous et toutes. And see you next week. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.